A night of luxury turns into a nightmare in front of the assembled elite. An elderly woman is berated by her own daughter-in-law in the middle of a crowded ballroom under paralyzed stares. Her son, a previously unshakable billionaire, breaks his silence upon seeing his mother fall. If this story caught your interest, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us what city you're watching from. Let's continue. The ballroom of the Plaza Hotel sparkled like never before on that September night. The light from the crystal chandeliers reflected off gala gowns, expensive jewelry, and the calculated smiles of people who knew exactly where they were and who they were talking to. A sea breeze drifted in through the open windows, offering a subtle relief from the heat of that Thursday in New York City. There, among entrepreneurs, politicians, and figures of Manhattan's high society, another charity event for the Sterling Foundation was underway, led by Robert Sterling, one of the richest and most influential men in the city. Robert was 45, with graying temples and a smile that graced the covers of business magazines. His empire started from scratch, or at least that's what he liked to repeat in interviews. The truth, which few knew, was that it all began with a small boarding house in Queens, run by his mother Eleanor, a woman of humble origins who worked her entire life to give her only son the education she never had. That night, Eleanor was there, but no one really saw her. She stayed close to the ballroom walls, wearing a simple beige linen suit that contrasted sharply with the haute couture dresses around her. Her shoes were comfortable, practical, the kind you buy for walking through the farmer's market on Sundays, not for treading on the gleaming marble of one of the most luxurious hotels in America. Eleanor was 78, but she looked older. Her shoulders were stooped, her hands trembled, her gaze was always downcast. She seemed to carry an invisible weight that made her smaller with each passing year. Robert moved through the ballroom with ease, shaking hands, laughing loudly, making jokes that drew roars of laughter from the international investors present. By his side, as always, was Vivian, his 32-year-old wife. She was everything he believed a woman should be to stand beside a man like him, tall, rail-thin, with impeccable blonde hair and a red dress that seemed to have been sewn directly onto her body. Vivian smiled little, but when she did, it was with the confidence of someone who knows all eyes are on her. And they were. Vivian and Robert had married 3 years earlier, in a ceremony that filled pages and pages of celebrity magazines. He had been a widower for 5 years when he met her at a corporate event. His first wife, Helen, had been a discreet, scholarly woman, a literature professor who died at 40 from health complications no one liked to discuss. Vivian was the opposite of Helen in every way. Where Helen was gentle, Vivian was sharp. Where Helen nurtured, Vivian commanded, and Eleanor felt it in her own skin, every single day. The old woman watched her son from a distance, trying to find in him some trace of the boy she had raised, the boy who slept clinging to her when he was afraid of thunderstorms, the boy who promised, with tears in his eyes, that when he grew up, he would take care of her forever. Where was that boy now? She couldn't answer. Maybe he had gotten lost, somewhere between the first million and the 10th floor of the Upper East Side penthouse, where they now lived. Vivian cast a quick glance in her mother-in-law's direction and wrinkled her nose, as if she had smelled something unpleasant. She leaned toward Robert and whispered something in his ear. He gave a sheepish laugh and shook his head, as if to say it wasn't the right time. But Eleanor saw. She always saw. Her eyes might be tired, but they still caught every gesture of contempt, every unspoken word, every silence that screamed. The foundation's PR director, Claire Mason, moved through the event with a tablet in hand and a discreet earpiece. She was competent, efficient, and absolutely ruthless when it came to protecting Robert's image. That night, she was especially tense. There were Japanese investors present, interested in a multi-million-dollar partnership. There was also a congressman who had just been named in an investigation and desperately needed to clean up his image. And worst of all, Claire was almost certain there was an undercover journalist among the guests. Her name was Patricia Fisher, and she worked for an investigative news website that had already taken down 3 politicians and 2 businessmen in the last 2 years. Patricia was there in a borrowed dress, a fake ID and a recording in progress on the phone hidden in her purse. She had received an anonymous tip 2 weeks earlier. The message was short, but impactful. It just said that Robert Sterling kept his own mother in degrading conditions, that the elderly woman was psychologically abused by her daughter-in-law, and that everything was covered up with money and threats to the staff. Patricia watched everything from a strategic corner of the ballroom. She had seen Eleanor arrive, practically dragged by a household employee. The old woman didn't want to be there, that was obvious. Her eyes conveyed fear, discomfort, and a deep sadness that not even the event's bright lights could hide. Dinner was served at 9 o'clock. The tables were decorated with imported flowers, gleaming silverware, and crystal glasses that cost more than an entire family's monthly salary. Eleanor was placed at a side table, far from the main table where Robert and Vivian hosted the important guests. At the old woman's table were foundation employees, some distant relatives who barely knew her, and a young woman who seemed lost amidst so much pomp. Eleanor ate little. Her stomach was in knots, as it always was when she had to leave the house. She preferred to stay in her small room in the penthouse, a tiny, simple space that looked more like a storage closet than a bedroom. The walls were white and bare. There were no photographs, no mementos. Vivian didn't allow it. She said old objects made the house look like a museum. So everything Eleanor had from her previous life was stored in 2 cardboard boxes under the bed. Photographs of her late husband, old certificates, a rosary, given to her by her own mother. Memories buried as if they were shameful. During dinner, Robert took the stage to give the opening speech. He spoke about social responsibility, about the commitment to underprivileged families, about the importance of extending a hand to those in need. The words were beautiful, well rehearsed, and drew enthusiastic applause from the audience. Eleanor didn't clap. She just looked at her own hands, wrinkled and marked by time, and wondered if her son really believed what he was saying. After dinner, the charity auction began. Works of art, jewelry, trips, exclusive experiences, all with stratospheric values, all sold with satisfied smiles and raised glasses. Vivian was radiant. She loved this kind of event. She loved being seen, admired, envied, and she knew she was. She knew other women looked at her with a mixture of desire and resentment, and it fueled her. It was during a break in the auction that the first incident of the night occurred. Eleanor, feeling unwell from the stuffy heat of the ballroom, got up to get a glass of water. She walked slowly, trying not to draw attention, but her movements were unsteady. Age and physical weakness were unforgiving. As she approached the beverage table, she lightly bumped into a waiter passing with a tray. The impact was minimal, but enough for a champagne flute to tip and spill a few drops on a nearby guest's dress. The guest was Vivian. The entire ballroom seemed to freeze. Vivian looked down at her red dress, now with small damp spots on the side, and then raised her eyes to her mother-in-law. The expression on her face was not one of surprise or common irritation. It was one of contained fury, of contempt built up over years, of a rage that had finally found an excuse to manifest. Eleanor began to tremble. She knew what was coming next. She knew that look. She tried to apologize, her voice coming out weak, almost inaudible. But Vivian wasn't interested in apologies. Robert approached quickly, trying to smooth things over. He placed a hand on his wife's arm, whispering something no one else could hear. But Vivian shook him off with a sharp movement. Her eyes were fixed on Eleanor, and the surrounding crowd began to realize something was wrong. Claire Mason, the PR director, rushed over to them, trying to intervene. She smiled at the nearest guests, made a gesture that everything was under control, but her voice was tense when she whispered to Robert that he needed to get his mother out of there immediately. Vivian, however, had no intention of letting it pass quietly. She took a step forward, closing in on Eleanor, and her voice, though controlled, carried a venom that cut deeper than any shout. She said, loud enough for dozens of people to hear, that this was unacceptable, that Eleanor was an embarrassment, that she had no manners, no class, no awareness of where she was. She said she was a burden, a weight, a nuisance she tolerated out of pure charity, but that there were limits, and that those limits had been crossed. The words fell on Eleanor like physical blows. The old woman tried to respond, but her voice failed. Her legs gave way. She clung to the nearby table to keep from falling, But the humiliation was already complete. The guests watched in shocked silence. Some looked away, embarrassed. Others watched with a morbid curiosity, as if they were watching a show. Robert finally reacted. He grabbed his mother's arm firmly and began to lead her out of the ballroom. Eleanor didn't resist. She just followed, head down, silent tears streaming down her wrinkled face. Behind her, Vivian remained the center of attention, adjusting her dress with exaggerated gestures, as if to ensure everyone saw the damage that had been done. Patricia Fisher, the undercover journalist, didn't miss a second. She activated her phone's camera and captured the final moments of the scene. The audio wasn't perfect, but the images were clear enough. She had what she needed, or at least she had the beginning. In the hallway, away from prying eyes, Robert let go of his mother's arm with a brusqueness he tried to disguise as urgency. He looked around, checking if anyone had followed them, and then whispered tensely that she needed to go home, that this had been a disaster, that she knew what Vivian was like and had provoked the situation anyway. Eleanor lifted her face, and for the first time in years, there was something besides submission in her eyes. There was hurt. She opened her mouth to speak, but Robert didn't let her. He called the driver, ordered him to take his mother back to the penthouse, and rushed back to the ballroom. He had investors to calm, a wife to appease, and a reputation to save. Eleanor was led to the car in silence. The driver, a middle-aged man named Nelson, who had worked for the family for over 10 years, looked at her in the rearview mirror. He knew that expression. He had seen it many times. He wanted to say something, to offer some comfort, but he knew it wasn't his place. So he just drove, in silence, through the brightly lit streets of New York, while Eleanor stared out the window, watching the city go by, and wondered when exactly her life had become this. Back at the event, Vivian was the center of a group of friends, retelling the incident with a distorted version of the facts. She painted Eleanor as a senile, problematic woman who insisted on creating embarrassing situations. The friends nodded in solidarity, saying Vivian had too much patience, that not everyone could put up with it. Robert returned to the ballroom trying to look calm, but Claire intercepted him immediately. She was pale. She told him they needed to talk urgently, that there were rumors of a journalist infiltrating the event, that the scene could make headlines. Robert's stomach sank. He knew family scandals were the worst for one's public image, especially in a year with elections for the presidency of the Chamber of Commerce. But he told Claire everything was under control, that Vivian was already handling the situation, that people would understand. Claire didn't seem convinced, but she had no choice but to trust him. Meanwhile, in a discreet corner of the ballroom, another guest watched everything with special interest. It was Frank Taylor, a former partner of Robert's in a real estate venture that had gone sour years ago. Frank had never forgiven Robert for cutting him out of the partnership when the business finally took off. He was there not out of friendship, but strategy, and this night had just handed him a gift. Frank took out his phone and started making some notes. He knew people in the press, he knew lawyers, he knew politicians who would love to see Robert stumble, and he had just witnessed the stumble. The night continued on its course. The auction resumed, conversations returned to normal, the music started again. But something had changed. A strange mood hung in the air. People smiled, but the smiles were forced. Conversations flowed, but with an underlying tension. Everyone knew they had witnessed something that shouldn't have happened, and everyone wondered what would come next. Patricia Fisher left the event around midnight. She went home, turned on her laptop, and started reviewing the material she had recorded. The images were a bit shaky, but the scene was clear. Vivian publicly humiliating her elderly mother-in-law. Robert, the great philanthropist, removing his mother from the ballroom as if she were a problem to be solved. Patricia smiled. This was just the beginning. She opened her files and reread the anonymous tip she had received. She needed more. She needed concrete proof. She needed witnesses willing to talk. And she knew exactly where to start looking. The next morning, the Upper East Side penthouse was silent. Vivian had slept in late, exhausted from the previous night. Robert was already at the office dealing with pending matters, and Eleanor was in her small room, sitting on the edge of the bed, looking at the 2 cardboard boxes that held her life. She picked up a yellowed photograph. It was of her and her husband, Anthony, on their wedding day. They were in front of the small neighborhood church, she in a simple wedding dress, he in a dark suit that was probably borrowed. They were smiling, genuinely smiling, smiling because they believed in the future. Eleanor pressed the photograph to her chest and let the tears fall freely. She thought of everything she had sacrificed, of all the nights she spent sewing for others to pay for her son's private school, of all the meals she skipped so he could eat better, of all the dreams she abandoned so his dreams could come true, and now here she was, alone, invisible, treated like a nuisance in the house her own sacrifice had helped build. But something was changing inside her, something small, fragile, but persistent, a spark of rebellion, an inner voice that was beginning to whisper that this wasn't right, that she didn't deserve this, that she had to do something, she didn't know what yet, she didn't have the strength yet, but the seed had been planted. And on the other side of the city, in a bustling newsroom, Patricia Fisher was on the phone with a source. The source was a former employee of Robert's household, fired abruptly 6 months earlier, without cause and without explanation. Her name was Joanna, and she had a lot to say. The story was just beginning. Joanna Smith was 42 and had worked as the head housekeeper in Robert Sterling's home for nearly 7 years. She knew every corner of that penthouse, every routine, every unspoken secret hidden behind closed doors. When she was fired 6 months ago, without warning, and with a cold bureaucratic termination letter, Joanna knew exactly why. She had seen too much, and worse, she had shown compassion for Eleanor. Now, sitting in a cafe in Greenwich Village across from Patricia Fisher, Joanna finally had a chance to speak. Her hands trembled slightly as she held her coffee cup, but her voice was steady. She started from the beginning, from the first few months after Robert's marriage to Vivian, when the change in the household dynamic became apparent to all the staff. Vivian arrived like a hurricane. Everything that Helen, the first wife, had built with delicacy and good taste was dismantled in a matter of weeks. The antique furniture, the family photographs, the objects with history, all were replaced with modern, minimalist, cold pieces. The house stopped feeling like a home and began to resemble a spread in a design magazine. Functional, impeccable, and completely soulless. And Eleanor, who previously had a large, cozy room on the same floor as her son, was relocated to a smaller space, almost a converted storage closet. Vivian justified it by saying she needed the room for her personal walk-in closet. Robert didn't protest. He just helped his mother move, promising it was temporary, that they would soon find a better solution. But 3 years passed and Eleanor remained in that little room. Joanna told Patricia about the meals. Eleanor no longer ate at the table with the family. Vivian said the old woman was too slow, made noise when she chewed and dropped food, staining the tablecloth. So Eleanor began to eat in the kitchen, alone or in her room. Her plates always came after everyone else had finished, often cold or reheated. Joanna tried, whenever possible, to serve the old woman with care, preparing special portions, but Vivian would notice and reprimand her severely. Then there were the outings. Eleanor could no longer receive visitors. The few friends she still had from her time in Queens were gradually pushed away with increasingly elaborate excuses. Vivian would claim the house was under renovation, that Robert was sick, that they were going on a trip. Anything to prevent outsiders from seeing how the great businessman's mother really lived. And when Eleanor tried to go out alone to take a walk, visit a church, or buy something at the pharmacy, there was always an obstacle. Vivian controlled the keys, controlled access to the private elevator, even controlled the old woman's money. Eleanor's social security checks were deposited into an account she could no longer access. Vivian had convinced Robert that his mother could be tricked by scammers, that it was safer for them to manage her finances. Patricia listened intently, taking notes. She asked Joanna if there were other witnesses, other people who could confirm these accounts. Joanna hesitated, but then mentioned Nelson, the driver, and Raquel, the cook, who still worked at the house. She didn't know if they would have the courage to speak, but she knew their character. They cared about Eleanor. There was, however, one detail Joanna had saved for last, something she had witnessed 3 months before being fired and could never forget. It was on a Tuesday afternoon. Vivian was in the living room talking on the phone with a friend when Eleanor came out of her room to get some water. She was barefoot, shuffling down the hallway. Vivian hung up the phone as soon as she saw her and walked toward her with quick, furious steps. Joanna was in the laundry room, but she could hear through the slightly ajar door. Vivian started screaming. She said Eleanor was a disgusting old woman, that she had no hygiene, that she smelled, that she was a disgrace. She said that, if it were up to her, the old woman would have been in a nursing home long ago, out of her sight. Vivian's voice was filled with pure hatred, a contempt so deep it seemed physically painful. Eleanor didn't respond. She just stood there, taking the words like verbal lashings, until Vivian finally tired and slammed the door. Joanna came out of the laundry room and found the old woman still standing in the same spot, trembling, tears streaming silently down her face. Joanna hugged her, took her back to her room, made her some tea and stayed by her, sighed until she calmed down. It was that hug that cost Joanna her job. Vivian saw her on the house's security cameras. The following week, Joanna was accused of petty thefts that never happened and fired for cause. She tried to defend herself, sought out Robert, but he was on a business trip. When he returned, he simply confirmed his wife's decision, saying he trusted her judgment. Patricia turned off the recorder and looked into Joanna's eyes. She asked if the former housekeeper would be willing to give an official statement to appear in a report, to face the consequences. Joanna took a deep breath. She was scared of not finding another job, scared of retaliation, scared of lawsuits. But she thought of Eleanor, of those tired, sad eyes, and said yes, she would do whatever it took. Meanwhile, in the Upper East Side penthouse, Robert was in his private office trying to concentrate on an investment spreadsheet, but failing miserably. His mind was still on the night before. He couldn't stop thinking about the expression on his mother's face when he led her out of the ballroom. There was something different there. It wasn't just hurt or sadness, it was disappointment, and Robert hated that feeling. He knew deep down that things had gone too far. He knew Vivian treated his mother with a cruelty he could no longer ignore, but he always found excuses. He told himself Vivian was stressed, that she had a strong personality, that she was just protecting the household standards. He told himself his mother understood, that she knew it was temporary, but he knew he was lying to himself. Robert remembered a conversation he'd had with Helen, his first wife, just a few months before she passed away. Helen was weak, but still lucid, and she held his hand tightly and said something he never forgot. She said that the true measure of a man wasn't in how much money he had or how many companies he ran. It was in how he treated those who could offer him nothing in return. It was in how he cared for the most vulnerable. Robert closed his eyes and rubbed his face with his hands. Helen had adored Eleanor. The two had a beautiful relationship of camaraderie and mutual respect. Helen called her mother-in-law Mom, and Eleanor returned the affection with genuine love. When Helen was gone, Robert felt he had lost not only his wife but also the moral compass that guided him. And then came Vivian. Beautiful, confident, determined. She was everything he thought he needed to overcome the pain. But gradually, he realized that Vivian didn't just want to be by his side. She wanted to be in charge, and he, tired of fighting, let her. The office door opened, and Vivian entered without knocking. She looked stunning, as always, wearing a white tailored suit and sky-high heels. She sat in the chair across from his desk and crossed her legs, with studied elegance. They needed to talk about the previous night, she said. They needed to align their stories. Claire was right to be worried about the press. Vivian had already received messages from a few friends asking about the incident. They needed to control the narrative before it spun out of control. Robert listened to her in silence. She had a plan. She always did. She suggested they release a statement saying Eleanor had felt unwell during the event, that she suffered from age-related health issues and was receiving appropriate care, that it was a delicate situation, and they asked for understanding and privacy. Robert shook his head slowly. He asked Vivian if she really thought that would work, if she really thought people were that naive. Vivian frowned, surprised by his tone. She said it would work if he played his part, if he appeared in public as the devoted son he always pretended to be. The word pretended hung in the air between them. Robert felt something snap inside him. He looked at the woman before him, this woman he thought he loved, and for the first time in 3 years he truly saw her. He saw the coldness, the manipulation, the emptiness, and he wondered how he had been so blind. But Robert wasn't brave enough to break away. Not yet. So he simply nodded, said he would do what was necessary, and Vivian left the office satisfied, her heels echoing down the marble hallway. That afternoon, Claire Mason called an emergency meeting at the Sterling Foundation headquarters. Present were Robert, Vivian, 2 corporate lawyers, and the communications director. Claire got straight to the point. They had a problem. A video was circulating in private WhatsApp groups. It hadn't gone viral yet, but it was only a matter of time. The video showed the final moments of the scene at the event. It showed Vivian humiliating Eleanor. It showed Robert leading his mother out of the ballroom. The quality wasn't great, but it was enough to cause damage. Claire had already contacted some influencers and bloggers to try to get ahead of it, but the situation was delicate. Vivian turned pale. She asked who had recorded it, who was spreading it. Claire didn't know but suspected a disgruntled guest or a hotel employee. The lawyers suggested lawsuits for defamation, invasion of privacy, damage to their image, but Claire cut them off. Lawsuits would draw more attention. The ideal solution would be a public retraction, a well-executed damage control operation. Robert listened to it all in silence. He felt trapped in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. Everything he had built, the entire reputation he had spent years establishing, was under threat. And the fault, he knew, was his. For being complicit. For choosing temporary peace over justice. The meeting ended with an action plan. Robert would do an Instagram Live that very night, showing himself at home, caring for his mother, being the attentive son. Vivian would stay in the background, discreet, showing support. Claire would draft an emotional script talking about the challenges of caring for an elderly family member and asking for empathy. But when Robert returned home and went up to his mother's little room, he found the door locked from the inside. He knocked gently, called her name, but there was no answer. He insisted, worried, until he finally heard Eleanor's faint voice saying she didn't want to talk to anyone. Robert rested his forehead against the door and closed his eyes. He apologized through the wood. He said he knew. He had failed her, that he wanted to fix things. But Eleanor didn't answer. She just stayed on the other side, sitting on the edge of her bed, listening to her son's empty words and wondering if there was anything left to fix. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Frank Taylor was in his office, meeting with 2 aides and a journalist from a tabloid website. He was showing them the video he had discreetly recorded at the event, commenting on Robert's hypocrisy, on how the great philanthropist treated his own mother. The journalist smiled, already imagining the headlines. Frank knew he was using the situation for personal revenge, but he didn't care. Robert was reaping what he had sown. Night fell over New York City. On the streets of Midtown, tourists walked along Broadway. On the Upper East Side, expensive restaurants served sophisticated dinners. And in the silent penthouse, 3 people lived under the same roof, but in completely separate worlds. Robert was in his office, rehearsing the script for the live stream. Vivian was in her bedroom, trying on outfits to choose the one that conveyed the most appropriate image, and Eleanor was in her little room, kneeling beside her bed, praying the rosary that had belonged to her mother, asking for strength for what she knew was coming, because something inside her had changed. The public humiliation at the event hadn't broken her. On the contrary, it had lit a flame, small but persistent. Eleanor was beginning to understand that staying silent wasn't protecting her son. It was betraying herself. It was betraying all the women who came before her and all who would come after. The next morning, Nelson arrived early at the penthouse to pick up Robert. But before heading to the garage, he knocked on the door of Eleanor's room. She opened it, surprised. Nelson handed her a folded piece of paper and said quietly that it was the phone number of a lawyer specializing in elder law. An acquaintance of his wife's. He said he wasn't asking for anything, just offering an option, and then he left, before anyone could see. Eleanor looked at the paper. The name written was Dr. Beatrice Nolan. She tucked the paper between the pages of her rosary and went back to bed, her heart pounding. For the first time in years, she felt something she no longer knew how to name: hope. And in a bustling newsroom in downtown Manhattan, Patricia Fisher was finishing her review of the first draft of her report. The working title was direct and impactful: The Dark Side of Philanthropy, When Charity Doesn't Begin at Home. She had testimonies, videos, evidence. She was only missing one thing: Eleanor's voice. Patricia knew it would be difficult to reach the old woman. The house was under surveillance, the calls were likely monitored, access was controlled. But she was persistent. And she had allies. Joanna had already mentioned that Nelson was a trustworthy person. Maybe there was a way. That night, Robert finally did the live stream. He appeared smiling, confident, next to his mother, who could barely look at the camera. Vivian stayed in the background, as planned. Robert spoke about family love, about challenges, about understanding. He read the script prepared by Claire with studied emotion, but the comments started pouring in. People questioning, people doubting, people who had seen the video and weren't buying the narrative. The live stream that was supposed to calm the waters was, in fact, fanning the flames of suspicion even more. Claire ended the broadcast, earlier than planned. Robert was visibly shaken. Vivian was furious. And Eleanor, who had been forced to participate in that charade, went back to her little room and cried herself to sleep. But while she slept, her old cell phone, which she didn't even know still worked, received a text from an unknown number. The message simply said, "Mrs. Sterling, my name is Patricia. I'm a journalist, and I want to help you. If you want to talk, please reply to this message. No one has to know." Eleanor didn't see the message that night, but she would see it the next morning. And she would have to make the most difficult decision of her life. Eleanor woke to the sound of birds chirping outside her window. For a brief moment, still drowsy, she forgot where she was. She forgot the public humiliation, the cramped room, the daughter-in-law who despised her. For an instant, she was back in the simple house in Queens, waking up next to her husband, making breakfast while listening to her son play in the yard. But then reality returned, heavy as always, and she opened her eyes to the blank white ceiling above her. She sat up slowly, feeling the aches in her joints that came with age. It was then that she saw the old cell phone on the nightstand. She almost never used it. In fact, she barely knew how to use most of its features. Robert had given it to her years ago, saying it was for emergencies, but then had only programmed his number and Vivian's, and Vivian never called. Ever. Eleanor picked up the phone and, with trembling fingers, tried to unlock it. It took a few minutes before she succeeded. And then she saw it, a message, from a number she didn't recognize. She put on her glasses and read it slowly once, then again. Her heart began to beat faster. A journalist, wanting to help her. Eleanor looked at the closed bedroom door. She heard the distant sounds of the house waking up. Vivian shouting orders at Raquel in the kitchen. Robert talking on the phone in his office. Life going on as if nothing had happened, as if she didn't exist. She looked at the message again. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She wanted to reply. She wanted to scream yes, that she needed help, that she couldn't take it anymore. But the fear was greater. Fear of what Vivian would do if she found out. Fear that Robert would send her away. Fear of being completely alone. So she turned off the phone, put it in the drawer, and went to the bathroom to wash her face. But the seed of possibility had been planted, and seeds once planted have a habit of growing. That morning, Patricia Fisher was anxious. She checked her phone every 5 minutes, waiting for a reply she knew might never come. Getting Eleanor's number had been a challenge. Nelson, the driver, had been very reluctant before passing on the information. He was afraid of losing his job, of being sued, of causing more trouble for the old woman. But Patricia had been convincing. She had promised protection, anonymity, and appealed to his conscience. In the end, Nelson had given in. Patricia already had enough material to publish the story: Joanna's testimony, the footage from the event, analysis from experts on elder rights. But she knew that without Eleanor's voice, the piece would be incomplete. It would be about her, but not from her. And Patricia wanted to give the old woman the chance to be heard. Meanwhile, at the Sterling Foundation, Claire Mason was having the worst day of her career. Social media was on fire. Robert's live stream had not only failed to calm the waters, but had thrown more fuel on the fire. People were sharing the video from the event, creating memes, making scathing comments. Some digital influencers, those specializing in exposing the hypocrisy of the elite, were already producing videos about the case. And to make matters worse, Claire had received a call from a reporter at a major news portal. He wanted an exclusive interview. With Robert, he wanted answers. He wanted the truth. Claire tried to negotiate, but the reporter was direct. He said that with or without their cooperation, the story would run, and it would be better for Robert if he participated. Claire scheduled an emergency meeting. This time, in addition to Robert and Vivian, she also summoned the chairman of the company's board of directors, Dr. Paul Andrews, a 65-year-old man, respected in the business community, who had been Robert's mentor in his early career. Paul was a father figure to Robert, and his opinion carried weight. When Paul arrived at the meeting and was briefed on the situation, his face hardened. He looked at Robert with a disappointment that cut deeper than any words could. Paul had known Eleanor since the days of the boarding house in Queens. He had been one of the first tenants, back when he was a broke college student. Eleanor had treated him like a son, preparing extra meals when she saw he was too thin, never charging extra, even when he was late with the rent. Paul asked, in a controlled but firm voice, if it was true, if Robert really allowed his own mother to be treated that way. Robert tried to explain, tried to justify, but the words came out weak, empty. Vivian intervened, trying to shift the focus, saying everything was being exaggerated, that there was a conspiracy to tarnish the family's image. But Paul cut her off. He said he didn't want to hear excuses. He said he was there not as chairman of the board, but as someone who owed everything he had to Eleanor's kindness, and that if Robert didn't take drastic action immediately, he would resign from his position and take half the board with him. The silence that followed was heavy. Robert knew Paul wasn't bluffing. Without him, the company would face a crisis. Investors would lose confidence. Contracts would be cancelled. Everything could fall apart. Vivian realized the gravity of the situation and, for the first time, seemed genuinely worried. She tried to speak, but Paul raised a hand, silencing her. He turned to Robert and said he wanted to see Eleanor. Immediately. Alone. Robert had no choice but to agree. An hour later, Paul was sitting in Eleanor's small room. The old woman, surprised and emotional to see the man she hadn't seen in years, began to cry before he even said a word. Paul hugged her, and there, in that simple embrace, years of silent pain finally found solace. They talked for almost 2 hours. Eleanor told him everything, every humiliation, every cruel word, every day she felt invisible in her own home. Paul listened in silence, holding her hands, and with each revelation, his determination grew stronger. She reminded Paul of when he was young, of when he would arrive at the boarding house hungry and without money to pay in advance, of how she would prepare special dishes for him, saying they were leftovers, though Paul knew they weren't, of how she sewed the buttons on his shirts, ironed his pants for job interviews, prayed for him to get the opportunities he deserved. Paul listened with tears in his eyes, remembering every gesture, every word of encouragement that woman had given him when he needed it most. And now to see her reduced to this, treated like a nuisance in the home of the son she had raised with so much sacrifice, was unbearable. Paul asked Eleanor why she had endured it for so long in silence. And her answer was simple but devastating. She said she was afraid of embarrassing her son, that she thought if she remained quiet, if she made herself invisible, at least Robert wouldn't have any problems. That she had believed a mother's love was to endure everything, to bear everything, to silence everything. When Paul left the room, he found Robert waiting in the hallway. The look Paul gave him was one of profound disappointment. He said only one thing before leaving, that Robert had until the end of the week to resolve this situation, that he expected to see Eleanor being treated with the dignity she deserved, or he would take drastic measures. And then he left, leaving Robert alone with the weight of his choices. That afternoon, something unexpected happened. Raquel, the cook, asked to speak with Robert. She had worked in the house for 2 years and had always been discreet, efficient, and quiet. But now she had something to say. She told Robert about the times Vivian forced her to serve cold food to Eleanor, about the days the old woman went without eating because Vivian forbade anyone from taking food to her room, about the mornings she found Eleanor in the kitchen in the middle of the night, eating leftovers because she was hungry. Robert listened in shock. He knew things weren't right, but he hadn't imagined the extent of the cruelty. Or maybe he had, and just didn't want to see. Raquel finished by saying she couldn't stand being an accomplice to it anymore, that if things didn't change, she would quit too. After Raquel left, Robert was alone in his office. He looked around at the walls decorated with diplomas and awards: Businessman of the Year, Philanthropist of the Year, Community Leader. All those accolades now seemed like a cruel joke. He had built an empire, but he had lost his soul in the process. He picked up the phone and called Vivian. He said they needed to talk. Vivian arrived in the office minutes later, annoyed at having her Pilates session interrupted. Robert took a deep breath and told her, for the first time in 3 years, that things had to change, that the way his mother was being treated was unacceptable, that he had been a coward, but he wouldn't be anymore. Vivian looked at him as if he had gone insane. She said she was tired of all this drama, that it was Robert's fault for not putting his mother in a nursing home from the start, that she hadn't married him to be an old woman's babysitter. The words were like blades, cutting through any illusion Robert still had about the character of the woman he had married. He asked her if that was how she really felt, if all this time she had just been pretending. Vivian laughed, a cold, humorless laugh. She said Robert was pathetic, that she had married him for the money, the status, the comfortable life, that love was for fairy tales, and that if he wasn't satisfied he could very well ask for a divorce, but she wouldn't leave empty-handed. Robert felt as if he had been punched in the gut. He had always known, on some level, that Vivian didn't love him the way Helen had, but to hear it said so cruelly, so openly, was different. It was real. It was final. Vivian stormed out of the office, slamming the door, and Robert, for the first time in years, allowed himself to cry. He cried for the mother who had sacrificed everything for him, cried for the wife he had lost who had truly loved him. He cried for the man he thought he was and who had never really existed. He looked at his own hands, the same hands that signed multi-million-dollar contracts, that shook the hands of politicians and businessmen, and saw that they were empty, empty of everything that truly mattered. Robert remembered a night, years ago, when he still lived in the boarding house with his mother. He must have been about 15. He was studying for an important exam when he heard his mother crying softly in the kitchen. He went to her and found her with her hands raw from so much sewing. She was taking on extra work to pay for his enrollment in a prep course. Robert had promised her that night that when he grew up, when he had money, his mother would never have to work again, that he would take care of her, that she would have everything she wanted. And look what it had become. She had a luxury penthouse, but lived in a cramped little room. She had access to expensive food, but ate cold leftovers. She had a rich son, but was completely alone. Robert realized in that moment of sharp pain that he had fulfilled his promise in the worst possible way. He had given his mother material things, but had taken from her what she really needed: respect, dignity, love. That night, Eleanor lay in her bed, unable to sleep. She thought about her conversation with Paul. She thought about all the stories she had told, all the tears she had shed. Something inside her was changing. The shame she had felt had turned into anger, a righteous, clean anger that made her want to stand up and fight. She picked up her phone again. She reread Patricia's message, and this time, with hands that were still trembling but determined, she typed a reply. Just 3 words. I want to talk. On the other side of the city, Patricia was about to give up waiting for the night when she felt her phone vibrate. She picked it up and read the message. A smile spread across her face. She replied immediately, asking where and when they could meet. She knew they had to be careful. The house was watched. Vivian controlled everything, but Nelson, when informed by Patricia of Eleanor's reply, had an idea. The following Tuesday, he was scheduled to take Eleanor for a routine doctor's appointment. It was one of the few times she left the house. Patricia could be at the doctor's office in disguise. They could talk there, away from Vivian's eyes. The plan was set, and for the first time in a long time, Eleanor felt something she had forgotten. Hope, real and palpable. Meanwhile, Frank Taylor hadn't been idle. He had contacted the tabloid journalist and provided not only the video, but also information about irregularities at the Sterling Foundation. He had documents, proof that some of the donations were being diverted to personal accounts. He wasn't sure if Robert was involved or if it was Vivian's doing, but it didn't matter. The scandal would be devastating either way. The journalist, excited by the material, began to dig deeper. He discovered that the foundation had overinflated contracts with shell companies. He found that charity events had inflated costs and that most of the money raised never reached the promised social projects. It was a complex and well-constructed web of corruption. The next morning, the website published the first story. The headline was, "Explosive, Philanthropy or Farce? Businessman's Foundation under investigation for misuse of funds." The report had numbers, documents, interviews with former employees. It was solid, irrefutable. The fallout was immediate. The news spread across social media in minutes. Other media outlets began to republish it. The phone in Robert's PR office wouldn't stop ringing. Claire was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. The lawyers went into damage control mode. When Robert read the article, he felt his world collapse around him. He called the accountant, the CFO, everyone involved in the foundation's management. He demanded explanations. And that's when he discovered the truth. Vivian had access to the foundation's accounts. She had created a scheme to embezzle funds that had been going on for over 2 years. She used the money to pay for personal credit cards, trips, extravagant shopping sprees, and she had forged his signature on several documents. Robert felt bile rise in his throat. He had been deceived, used, and worst of all, his reputation, everything he had worked for, was being destroyed because of the greed of a woman he thought he loved. He summoned Vivian immediately. She arrived nonchalantly, as if nothing had happened. When Robert threw the documents on the table and confronted her, she didn't even try to deny it. She just shrugged and said he had plenty of money, that he wouldn't miss it, that if he were smart, he would cover it up and move on. But Robert was no longer the passive man he had been. He told Vivian he wanted a divorce, immediately, and that she would be held criminally responsible for what she had done. Vivian laughed in his face. She said he didn't have the guts, that she would destroy him publicly if he tried anything against her, that she had proof of his own irregularities, things she had kept as insurance. It was war, and Robert finally understood who he was married to. That Tuesday, as planned, Nelson took Eleanor to her doctor's appointment. Patricia was there, disguised as a nurse. When the old woman entered the room, they looked at each other and, without needing words, understood one another. Eleanor told her everything. From the beginning, from the day Vivian entered her life and turned everything upside down. Patricia recorded the testimony with Eleanor's express permission. It was over 40 minutes of raw, honest, painful narrative. When they finished, Patricia held Eleanor's hands and told her she was very brave, that her story would help other people, that she was no longer alone. Eleanor cried, but this time they weren't tears of pain. They were tears of relief. Leaving the doctor's office, Eleanor felt different, lighter, as if a weight she had carried for years had finally been lifted from her shoulders. She looked up at the blue New York sky, and for the first time in a long time, she smiled. On the way back to the penthouse, Nelson noticed the change in her. In the rearview mirror, he saw Eleanor looking out the window, but not with that usual empty gaze. There was something different, a spark. He didn't ask anything, just drove in respectful silence, but his heart felt lighter. After so many years of witnessing that woman's suffering, he finally saw a sign that something was changing. Eleanor watched the streets of New York pass by the window. She saw people walking, working, living their lives, and for the first time in years, she felt that she was a part of it too, that she also had a right to be, there to be seen, to be heard. She thought of all the women like her, hidden in luxurious or simple homes, suffering in silence because they believed it was their role to endure, and she felt that her courage, however small, could make a difference. Meanwhile, in the penthouse, Vivian was packing her bags, not because Robert had asked her to, but because she knew things were spinning out of control. She had a plan B, she always did. She called her lawyer, a man known for defending and winning lost causes. She told him she wanted half of everything, and that she would stop at nothing to get it. The battle was just beginning. But this time Robert had allies. Paul, Nelson, Raquel, Joanna, and most importantly, he had his own mother, who had finally found her voice. And at the center of it all, Patricia was working on the final report. The report that would change everything. She had all the elements: Eleanor's testimony, the proof of embezzlement, the accounts from former employees. It was a complete story. Powerful. Irrefutable. Publication was set for the following Monday, and New York City, and perhaps the entire country, would be shocked. Monday dawned with a cloudy sky over New York City. Heavy clouds gathered over the East River, as if nature itself sensed that something important was about to happen. In the newsroom of the website where Patricia worked, the tension was palpable. The report was ready, reviewed 3 times, checked by lawyers. At 9 o'clock in the morning, it would be published. Patricia had barely slept. She knew the impact this story would have. It wasn't just about Robert Sterling or Vivian. It was about all the Eleanors in America, all the invisible elderly, mistreated in silence within their own families, all the women who dedicated their lives to their children and, in their old age, were forgotten, humiliated, treated like burdens. In the Upper East Side penthouse, Robert hadn't slept either. He had spent the night in his office, surrounded by documents, trying to understand the extent of the damage Vivian had caused. The lawyers had been clear. The situation was extremely serious. Misappropriating funds from a charitable foundation was a federal crime. Even if he could prove he wasn't involved, his reputation would never fully recover. Vivian, for her part, was in a 5-star hotel in Soho. She had left the penthouse 2 days earlier, taking with her suitcases full of clothes and jewelry. Her lawyer had advised her to keep her distance while they prepared her defense. She was confident. She had always gotten what she wanted in life. Why would this time be any different? Eleanor woke up early, as always, but this morning was different. She knew the report would be published. Patricia had told her. And although she was nervous, there was a peace in her heart. For the first time in years, she wasn't just existing. She was living, she was fighting. At 9 o'clock sharp, the report went live. The headline pulsed on the computer and phone screens of thousands of people. The screaming silence. The story of an elderly woman abused by her own family. The article was extensive, detailed, emotional. It began with Eleanor's testimony, transcribed respectfully and with dignity. She told, in her own words, about the years of humiliation, loneliness, and disrespect. The reaction was instantaneous and overwhelming. Within minutes, the story was trending on social media. Influencers shared it, celebrities commented, ordinary people were moved. Many shared their own stories of abused elders in their families. It was as if a collective wound, long hidden, was finally being exposed to the light. Robert's phone began to ring incessantly. Journalists wanting statements, friends wanting to know if it was true, business partners demanding explanations. Claire called, desperate, saying they needed an immediate response, but Robert didn't know what to say. How could he explain the inexplicable? How could he justify years of complicity? It was then that Paul Andrews arrived at the penthouse. He didn't call, didn't give a warning, he simply showed up, with the authority of someone who had the right to be there. He found Robert broken, with deep dark circles under his eyes, his face marked by guilt and exhaustion. Paul sat next to him and for the first time didn't come with criticism or demands. He came with empathy. Paul said he understood the pressure, understood the fear, understood how easy it was to get lost in so much success and forget what really mattered. He told Robert about his own mistakes, about the times he put work before family, about the regrets he carried. And then he said something that changed everything, that it wasn't too late to do the right thing. That courage wasn't about never falling, it was about getting up after the fall. Robert listened in silence, tears streaming freely down his face. He asked Paul what he should do, and Paul answered with devastating simplicity. Go to your mother, kneel before her and ask for forgiveness, not for the cameras, not for the press, but for her. And then spend the rest of your life making it up to her. At that moment, Eleanor was in her little room, receiving visitors. Joanna had returned, brought by Nelson. Raquel had come up with a special breakfast tray. The three women were there around the old woman when Robert knocked on the door. Eleanor hesitated. Part of her wanted to send him away, wanted him to feel the pain of rejection as she had felt so many times. But another part, the part that was still a mother, told her to open the door. And she did. Robert entered, and seeing his mother surrounded by these women who supported her, felt the full weight of his absence. He didn't wait, didn't rehearse beautiful words. He simply knelt before his mother and began to cry. He asked for forgiveness. Forgiveness for being a coward, for choosing false peace over justice, for allowing her to suffer while he pretended not to see. Eleanor placed a trembling hand on her son's head. She didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't. She didn't say she completely forgave him, because the pain was too deep. But she said it was a start, and sometimes a start is all we need. Joanna, Raquel, and Nelson, who had witnessed the scene, were also crying. Joanna remembered all the times she had found Eleanor alone, trembling with fear, swallowing her pain in silence. Raquel thought of the cold meals she had been forced to serve, the times she saw the old woman hungry and could do nothing. Nelson recalled the silent drives, the sad glances in the rearview mirror, the helplessness of knowing but being unable to act. And now there, in that little room that had been a prison but was about to become a place of freedom, they all felt that something fundamental was changing. It wasn't just about one family, it was about all families. It was about all the times silence was chosen over truth, about all the times convenience won over compassion. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, Vivian was having a nervous breakdown. Her lawyer had informed her that the situation was worse than they had imagined. The district attorney's office had already opened an investigation. The IRS was investigating. Bank accounts would be frozen. She could go to prison. Vivian, for the first time in her life, felt real fear. Not the fear of losing luxuries or status, the fear of losing her freedom. She tried to call Robert, but he didn't answer. She tried to call friends, but no one wanted to be associated with her. She was alone, completely alone. And then she understood. Eleanor, the old woman she had despised so much, had something Vivian would never have. She had people who truly loved her, people willing to fight for her. Vivian only had opportunists who abandoned her at the first sign of trouble. Back at the penthouse, Robert made a decision. He would hold a press conference, not to justify himself, but to take responsibility. Claire tried to dissuade him, saying it was risky, that he could make things worse. But Paul supported him, and Robert was determined. The press conference was scheduled for that afternoon, at the headquarters of the Sterling Foundation. Dozens of journalists attended. Cameras from national networks, reporters from news portals, digital influencers. Everyone wanted to hear what the man at the center of the scandal had to say. Robert took the stage alone. No aides by his side, no lawyers to control his words. Just him, a microphone, and the truth. He began by confirming everything in the report. He confirmed that his mother had been mistreated. He confirmed that he had been complicit. He confirmed that there had been misuse of funds at the foundation, though not at his initiative. But the most impactful moment was when he apologized, not just to his mother, but to all the elderly in America who lived in similar situations. He cried in front of the cameras, not theatrically but genuinely, and he said that from that day forward, he would dedicate his life to correcting his mistakes, that he would create real programs to protect the elderly, that he would use his voice and his resources to change the reality of those who had no voice. The journalists' questions came in an avalanche about Vivian, about the divorce, about the investigations. Robert answered everything with painful honesty. He confirmed he would be getting a divorce, that he would cooperate with the authorities, that he would accept the consequences of his choices. The press conference ended, but the fallout was just beginning. Some criticized him, saying it was too late, that it was just damage control. Others were moved by his sincerity. But everyone agreed on one thing. Eleanor's story had touched the entire country. On social media, hashtags like Marg Voice for the Elderly and America's Eleanor's started trending. People shared photos of their own elderly mothers, grandmothers and aunts telling similar stories. Accounts of psychological abuse, forced loneliness, disrespect disguised as care. It was as if the floodgates had broken and a river of contained pain was finally finding an outlet. On television shows, experts debated the phenomenon. Psychologists talked about ageism, about how society makes the elderly invisible. Lawyers explained the rights guaranteed by law but rarely respected. Social workers revealed alarming numbers of reports that never resulted in punishment. Eleanor's story had become the catalyst for a national conversation that was long overdue. In the following days, demonstrations began to emerge. NGOs for elder protection gained visibility. Congressmen began discussing stricter laws against elder abuse. Specialized police units were created. Hotlines were made available. One woman's pain had transformed into social change. Vivian was formally indicted. The evidence against her was irrefutable. Forged documents, proven embezzlement, employee testimonies. Her lawyer tried to make a deal, but the DA's office was unyielding. She would stand trial, and the sentence, when it came, would be exemplary. Meanwhile, in the Upper East Side penthouse, quiet transformations were taking place. Robert emptied Vivian's walk-in closet and turned it back into a bedroom for his mother. A large, airy room with a view of the river. He brought back the antique furniture Helen had loved so much, the family photographs, the objects with history. The house began to feel like a home again. Eleanor, for the first time in years, sat at the dining table with her son. They ate together, in silence at first, but gradually conversations began to emerge. Conversations about the past, about Helen, about mistakes, about regrets. It wasn't easy. The wound was deep, but it was beginning to heal. Joanna was rehired, not as a housekeeper, but as Eleanor's companion. Nelson received a raise and a formal apology for being put in such a difficult position. Raquel was given full autonomy in the kitchen, with instructions to always prepare meals with Eleanor's well-being in mind. Paul Andrews temporarily took over as president of the foundation while a full audit was conducted. It was discovered that the financial hole was bigger than imagined. Vivian had embezzled nearly $3 million over 2 years. Robert sold personal properties to replace the amount and ensure the social projects could continue. 3 months after the report was published, Patricia Fisher was invited to receive an award for investigative journalism. In her acceptance speech, she dedicated the award to Eleanor, calling her a hero. Eleanor was in the audience, accompanied by Robert. When she heard her name, she stood up, and the entire auditorium gave her a standing ovation. The applause was not just for her, but for all the elderly women who were finally being seen. Vivian's trial took place 6 months after the scandal. The courtroom was packed. She entered with her head down, without her former arrogance. The trial lasted 3 days. Witnesses were heard, evidence was presented, tears were shed. When it was Eleanor's turn to testify, a reverent silence fell over the courtroom. She walked to the witness stand with difficulty but with dignity, and then she told her story one more time. But this time, there was no shame in her voice. There was strength. The strength of someone who had survived and decided her pain would have meaning. She spoke about the years she raised Robert alone after her husband passed away, about the sleepless nights sewing for others, about the meals she skipped so her son could eat better, about the pride she felt when he was accepted into college, when he opened his first company, when he achieved success. And then, in a firm voice filled with emotion, she spoke about how that same success had pushed her away from the son she loved. It wasn't an angry accusation. It was an honest, painful, necessary account. She told of the loneliness, the constant fear, the nights spent crying in silence. And when she finished, there wasn't a dry eye in the courtroom. Even the judge, a 60-year-old man known for his toughness, had to discreetly wipe his glasses. Vivian listened with her head bowed. She didn't dare look her mother-in-law in the eye she couldn't have borne. What she would have seen there? Not hatred, not revenge, but something worse, pity. The verdict came a week later. Vivian was sentenced to 5 years in prison for embezzlement, forgery, and elder abuse. The sentence was harsh, but fair, and it served as an example that no matter how rich or powerful someone is, justice sometimes prevails. A year after the scandal, life had found a new rhythm. Robert never fully recovered his reputation, but he had gained something more valuable. Respect. The respect of those who knew he had owned his mistakes and was genuinely trying to be a better man. The Sterling Foundation was restructured and began to focus exclusively on the protection and support of vulnerable elderly people. Shelters were opened, visitation programs were created, hotlines operated 24 hours a day. Eleanor became unintentionally a public figure. She gave talks at schools, participated in campaigns, visited nursing homes. Her story inspired thousands. She received letters daily from elderly people who, upon hearing her story, found the courage to report their own situations. And on a sunny afternoon in December, exactly 1 year and 3 months after that fateful night at the plaza, a different kind of event took place. In the same ballroom where it all began, the Eleanor Sterling Center for Elder Care and Protection was inaugurated. The ballroom was full again. But this time, there was no falsehood, no empty pomp. There was truth. There were people who genuinely cared. Paul, Nelson, Raquel, Joanna, Patricia, representatives from NGOs, politicians committed to the cause, and hundreds of elderly people who came to give thanks were all there. When Eleanor took the stage to cut the ribbon, she looked out at the ballroom and saw in the back, near the wall where she used to stand, invisibly an elderly woman, dressed simply, looking around uncomfortably, trying not to draw attention. Eleanor recognized that look. It was her own look from a year ago. She asked for the woman to be brought to her. The old woman came, frightened, thinking she had done something wrong. But Eleanor hugged her. She held her hands and said in a firm voice, "You are not alone. You will never be alone again." The woman, who they later learned was named Mrs. Cecilia, began to cry. She told them between sobs that she lived with her daughter and son-in-law but felt like a burden. That she slept in the laundry room because there was no more space for her. That she ate after everyone else, always the leftovers. That she was at the event because she had seen the report about Eleanor and thought that if that woman had courage, maybe she could too. Eleanor held Cecilia's face in her hands and, looking deep into her eyes, said that courage doesn't come all at once, that it took her years to find her own, but that the important thing was to start, to take the first step, and that from now, Aunt Cecilia would have help. She would have the center, she would have social workers, she would have lawyers. She would have, above all, people who cared. The entire ballroom watched the scene in emotional silence, and many understood in that moment that this was bigger than an event. It was the birth of a movement. It was the promise that no Eleanor, no Cecilia, no elderly American would ever have to suffer in silence again. And it was in that moment that Robert, watching from a distance, finally understood the true meaning of philanthropy. It wasn't about organizing lavish events or appearing on magazine covers. It was about seeing another person, truly seeing them and choosing to act. It was about turning pain into purpose. It was about being the change the world needed. After the ceremony, Robert and Eleanor went home together. They had dinner on the terrace, watching the sunset over the city. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. Some things are felt, not said. Eleanor took her son's hand and squeezed it lightly. And Robert understood. It was forgiveness. It wasn't forgetting, it never would be. But it was moving forward. It was rebuilding. It was choosing love over resentment. That night, before going to sleep, Eleanor took the cardboard box from under her bed. The photographs, the certificates, the rosary. She no longer needed to hide them. Robert had installed shelves in her new room, and there she lovingly arranged her memories. Her Anthony smiled from a frame on the dresser. The wedding photo finally displayed. Finally honored. She lay down and, for the first time in years, slept peacefully. Without fear, without anguish, without pain. just peace. The peace of someone who fought and won. Not a victory over other people, but over silence, over invisibility, over the unjust shame she had carried for so long. On the other side of the city, Patricia was at home, in front of her computer, starting a new investigation. There were so many stories yet untold, so many voices still silenced. But she knew that one by one these stories would come to light, and that every story told was a life possibly saved. In a cold cell in a women's prison, Vivian stared at the ceiling, unable to sleep. She thought about everything she had lost. The mansion, the clothes, the jewelry, the status. But more than that, she thought about something she never had, and now understood she never would. True love. The kind of love Eleanor received from people who had nothing to gain from it. The kind of love that survives storms. And somewhere in New York City, in a simple house, an elderly woman who had seen Patricia's report picked up the phone for the first time in years. She dialed the number for the abuse hotline, and in a trembling but firm voice she said, "I need help." And for the first time she believed she would be heard, because that's how change happens. Not in grand, sudden revolutions, but in small acts of courage, in voices that refuse to remain silent, in stories that need to be told. And the story of Eleanor, a simple woman from Queens who was almost erased by contempt, became the story of thousands. It became a symbol, a reminder that dignity is not something lost with age. It is something that was always there, waiting to be recognized. In the end, Robert's true fortune wasn't in his bank accounts or his properties. It was in the ability to look into his mother's eyes and see, for the first time in years, not pain but hope. It was in knowing that despite all his mistakes, he still had time to do the right thing. And Eleanor, sitting on her terrace, watching the stars over the city skyline, smiled. Not the forced smile of someone pretending to be fine, but the genuine smile of someone who finally, after so long, was home. Truly home. Because home isn't a place. It's a feeling. It's where we feel safe, loved, seen. And after a long and painful journey, Eleanor had finally found her way back home. And as the gentle night breeze caressed her face, she closed her eyes and gave thanks. She gave thanks for the strength she found when she thought she had none left. She gave thanks for the people who appeared when she needed them most. And she gave thanks for having lived long enough to see that sometimes justice is slow but it arrives, and that when it arrives it transforms not just one life, but an entire country. End of story. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Eleanor and Robert has deeply touched your heart. If you were moved by this journey of pain, courage, and redemption, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments which moment affected you the most. Every day, we bring intense stories like this one, which reveal the deepest conflicts of the human soul and remind us of the strength that exists within each of us. Your presence here makes all the difference. We look forward to seeing you in the next episode with a new story that will make you reflect on the bonds that unite us and the choices that define us. See you soon.